Okay. So, everyone, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are in the planet. So, welcome to our game-based approach expert roundtable discussion. And today we have the pleasure to have here Dr. Karen Richardson, Dr. Tim Hopper, Dr. Luis Garcia López from the first two from the States, and Luis Garcia López from Spain. So this is kind of an event, what did you always want to ask to? So, and those people today are Karen, Luis, and Tim. Okay, so I'll do just a quick go through the short biography about uh, Professor Karen Richardson. She's a professor and department chair in the Health and Kinesiology department at Bridgewater State University, Bridgewater, MA, which is MA, Massachusetts? No.
Massachusetts, yes.
Yeah, great. So Dr. Richardson has worked collaboratively with colleagues in her university and globally to create an undergraduate physical education teacher licensure program rooted in a student-centered and game-based approach, a graduate professional stage licensure program in physical education in teaching games for understanding, a graduate program in tennis professional management and coaching rooted in a game-based approach, and created collaborative online international exchange students and faculty exchanges and institutional partnerships with colleagues in Japan. Her scholarly interests are in areas of student-centered approaches to teaching and learning in physical education and in higher education, that is student partnership. Well, teaching games for understanding, technology in PETE, and the development of tactical decision-making competence in gameplay. She is committed to promoting learner game-centered approaches in her teaching and scholarship. And before we move to the other guests, our special guests, I would deliver the first question to Karen before I move on to the other partners. So, but tell me just a bit about this journey. What was your journey like to game-based approach? How did it enter in your life, this interest, this focus, this passion?
Well, first, thank you so much for including me. I'm really humbled that you'd invite me to be part of this panel. And sort of, what is my journey? And I first I want to say that my journey in a game-based approach has always been a we. All the learning that I have done about a game-based approach has been done with other people. And so if ever I say it is a we, and I'll refer to the we's throughout it. But I think my journey started really as a child, trying to figure out ways I could play games with my siblings. We grew up in rural Maine. There weren't a ton of opportunities to do sport. And so the first place that I think I realized that you could play and modify games were with my siblings. And so that was really important. But then, my journey as a undergrad student at Springfield College, I didn't really experience learning from a game-based approach, but I was really introduced to movement education. And in movement education, I really started thinking about movement questions and opportunities to explore solutions through movement. My first teaching job, I was also a coach, and I was coaching a sport I didn't know well. I was the women's soccer coach. I'd never played soccer other than playing in the yard with my brothers. And I quickly approached teaching soccer, using small-sided games, using grids, and then asking my players, because really I didn't know, they didn't know that, hey, what do you see? What do you notice? What could we do different? We also started, because we weren't very good that first year, I started changing like what our goals were. Hey, let's just see if we can, get across midfield 6 times in the first half. So it was interesting. I think it's in me to think about modifying games, but really my formal introduction to a game-based approach came in my doctoral work at UMass Amherst. I worked with Linda Griffin while I was a doctoral student, and really I became sort of enamored with the approach because it worked. I saw students in our activity courses learning, and I had not experienced that when I had been taught really from a skill-based approach. In my work as a professor at Bridgewater State University, I was able to come in and completely change our methods courses to using a game-based approach. A few years after I got there, my colleague Deb Shihai came, and we have been a team really ever since, leading that program. And so research has been all related to game-based approaches. Our teacher education program, from start to finish, our students are using a game-based approach. So that's really, how I got started.
Great. So imagine you mentioned your partnership with Deb Shihai, and I would imagine with also with the cat, which is now also being a participant.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll move on now to Dr. Professor Tim Hopper. He has been around for a while, and he's someone that is a big reference for us all, for me personally also. So Dr. Tim Hopper is a professor in the School of Exercise and Science, Physical and Health Education in the Faculty of Education, University of Victoria, BC, in Canada. So I don't know what BC stands, sorry. BC?
British Columbia.
British Columbia, thank you. So Dr. Hopper has been at the University of Victoria since 1998. He currently is a professor in the School of Exercise Science, Physical and Health Education. His scholarly work focuses on teacher education, physical education, and applications of complexity theory in teaching and learning. Dr. Hopper has taught all the levels of the school curriculum, both in Canada and the UK. He's currently working on creating self-organizing systems of learning by applying ecological dynamics and complexity thinking to the teaching of games, with a particular emphasis in recent times on teaching tennis. He has published over 25 peer-reviewed articles and chapters on the TGfU ideas and practices. His current research projects focus on using digital assessment systems to promote student learning through competency-based, authentic, personal, and contextual-based assessment. He has chaired the PHE Research Council of Canada, has been president of the Canadian Association for Teacher Education, and was chair and past chair of the TGfU International SIG from 2010 to 2014. So, Antip, I will shoot the same question to you. How did game-based approach appear in your life?
It's interesting because you're asking that question, so I wrote down a quick thought, but it really was. I'm thinking back to what Linda said and Karen. As a kid playing, my mum first would get me to throw catch, and my dad would play games. But whenever I played with my dad, he always modified the game. So, and he was better than me initially. He would make his space bigger and mine smaller, and then gradually. He was a physiotherapist who was always modifying for his patients. So it was a natural thing for him to do with me. And I think that immediately got me figuring out where space was, how they use time. But my answer, when you asked me, I put down here, I was teaching in a city school in Exeter, and I was like the regional tennis champion. I thought, I'd be a piece of cake. And I went to teach these kids in the school on my practicum. And within the first 5 minutes, there was about 20 balls on the sports hall roof because they were just whacking it everywhere. And the teacher said, if I haven't got the balls, 20 balls in this bucket, you're going to fail your practicum. So I had to rethink how to teach tennis because I didn't know. And I went and read Rethinking Games. And I found, Rod's chapter. Oh my God, I'm going to do this. So I went back in and basically started teaching with big balls, and they were throw catch games. I had like tape everywhere, making courts. And from then on, I started teaching TGfU. And what was interesting, no one else in my university was doing that. I was at Exeter University, St. Luke's, and no one was talking about TGfU. I read the Rethinking Games, and from then on, every single sport I taught that way. So I had that shock experience, I think, as a tennis coach who's becoming a teacher, and it shifted me.
Great. So let's move on to Dr. Luis García López from Spain. He's a full professor in University of Castilla-La Mancha since 2000. His research and teaching focuses on topics of physical education and sport pedagogy and social justice, both at schools and in community programs. His scholarly works focus on teacher education, pedagogical models, and applications of salutogenesis and critical pedagogy in physical education. So Luis has worked as a teacher in primary and secondary school and has been a football coach for more than 15 years. So he has also published over 50 peer-reviewed papers, 15 chapters, and 5 books, where TGfU is one of the main focuses. In his current research, he is trying to implement salutogenic and activist programs to promote health and well-being in youth, especially those from socially vulnerable backgrounds. So, Luis, can you now tell us a bit more about the appearance of game-based approach in your life? How did it happen?
Hello, Claudio. Hello, all. Well, thank you for considering me as someone wanted to ask something, and so I'm very honored for the invitation and sharing this virtual table with Karen and team. Well, it was a good reason to reflect on previous experiences, and I have to say that I nearly played football professionally when I was young, and that is something that influenced me a lot. But I was mad about football for a long time, but in a very soon I was not that kind of player who knows everything about teams and about dates and so on. I was that kind of person who was very engaged with his community. So I promoted competitions and I coached teams since I was 14 or 15 years old. When I started studying sports sciences, I gave up football. And in the second year, I was studying sports sciences. Pepe Davis and Carmen Peiró presented a book in my faculty about teaching games for understanding, in which they translated into Spanish some of the chapters of the classical of Thorpe, Bunker, and Ammon, Rethinking Games Teaching. So when I discovered that book, for me, it was like an illumination. So I said, there is something beyond techniques and skills and so on. So I decided, and I did everything I could during my BSc, all the works. I related them to teaching games for understanding. I did my PhD on thematic approaches on teaching games for understanding, and I got my position in the university. Since I got my position in the university in 2000, I've been teaching game-based approaches to primary school teachers and as professional development to secondary school teachers also. I have been training, as you said before, for a long time. soccer. I don't do it anymore because I don't have more time, but I have learned a lot from my experiences in soccer, and I have supervised several PhDs. For example, David Gutierrez PhDs. Yes, I know I look younger than him, but I'm not. Well, as Karen said, we owe a lot to those people who have worked with. And David has been my brother in nearly all we have done, of course, in the TGfU thing.
Luis, I have more questions. Don't.
Good. That was
you
all.
can
That was
save
all.
your breath for a bit of more content.
That was all.
So
Thank you.
I'll get back to you soon. Thank you so much for this. And I can connect with your trajectory very, very closely because I was too a football professional player and coach. So I know what you mean about being mad about with football. And on the contrary to you, well, you choose not to play football. I cannot play because my left knee just, I think, passed away in the last year or something. So let's see. So I'll get back to passing the ball again to Karen. So if you want to talk a bit more, do you remember when you first made a contact with this the TGfU approach with the Bunker and Thorpe and Almond work? Did you recall that moment? Was there an immediate impact? Was there something that was growth with time, or with certain particular circumstances that lead to it?
God, interesting question. It probably happened at one of our seminars at UMass Amherst, so it must have been a Monday night when I first came in contact with that reading. But as I sort of shared as I started, when I first had the language to think about a game-based approach, and I first learned about TGfU and started reading, it really was a moment where all these things are happening in your thinking, that you're coming together and you're open for this idea. So certainly for me, that work, that the reading came during my doctoral studies, and but then I think that that work started to come to life in a study that we did with a volleyball class. We had a volleyball course that was just a general physical activity course at the university that we worked with Linda and the other doctoral students, and we ran the course using a game-based approach. And that was a great opportunity for me to really be bridging sort of the theoretical, the reading of Bunker and Thorpe's work, and then putting it into action, and then seeing really a general population of students learn from the approach and to get a sense of all the possibilities. So that to me, that was kind of the moment that it started to click. And then the other part for me, and I'll always come back to it, were the moments where then I am learning about the sport in a way that is really meaningful and deepening my ability to then to teach. So that's, I guess that's where I started.
Great. What about you, Tim? How was it for you, this contact with the model? And because you were also a teacher, how did it work when you started to implement, or teaching others to implement, and you actually seeing that the impact that it had on students, on teachers, on, well, the ecology of the places?
Well, I think going back to my previous example is I may have read Bunker and Thorpe and Almond's text, but within me were latent beliefs that this is how to do it. I didn't know that at the time. And my tennis example is because I was a good tennis player, I knew that and I'd been trained that way. But as soon as I let go of that way of doing tennis, I then realized, well, that should apply to soccer. Or that's basketball. Well, that's how you do volleyball. Because my beliefs were that the way I'd learned was these modifications of games. And I played and practiced games. And I was always changing games to make them work for the people that were there. So I think I was always going to be a PE teacher, really, because I had this I get this bad reputation of always, well, you're always changing the rules. well, yeah, but I want a close game. That's why I don't want to just win, right? And it was sort of interesting. So I think that tallied up, and that made me able then to read what Duncan, Thorpe, and Armin were writing and implement it. Because I always reflect back, why weren't more of my colleagues who were at university with me doing the same thing? And it wasn't common, except I do recognize some of the soccer players, going back to Louis' example, because of the grid work, they had an understanding, oh, this is how you teach soccer. So they didn't just do the skills of soccer, they always were working in grids. And so they were picking up on it. But it tended to be only in soccer. They didn't necessarily transfer it to they wouldn't do tennis the way I was doing it. So it's sort of interesting, what is that trigger that shifts you back to what Linda was saying, appreciating the game, appreciating the learner trying to appreciate the game. Because until you, as a teacher, take that up, you're just teaching a game that you're good at, right? And then we're not really engaging the learners, and we're focusing so much on the game, we're just not seeing the purpose of the game. Which is what I see in the school right now. I'm trying to help these teachers, and they just want to teach the game. And these kids are not playing the game that you're teaching. Why are you forcing them through this horrible experience? But, I'm trying to figure out a way to communicate that to them in a nice way.
Great. So there is a special taste in doing things that when we realize we are doing things differently. So that is cool because it kind of feeds us to move on and to believe in what we are doing. And Luis, so we had this also interesting and very rich pathway as a teacher, as a coach, and then as a teacher educator, and still related with this first contact to these pedagogies that, well, it obviously shape your way of seeing physical education and coaching and the teacher's role and the student's role. So how was it for you to try to conciliate, to balance this experience from you as a teacher and then going up to teacher educator as a teacher in the teacher educator role? How did you try to manage all this? Luis, can you turn on the
Microphone.
mic? Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, in our BSc in Spain, we have we have always had a specific model of teaching games for understanding. So it was not difficult for me trying to use all the information I was working with, try to use it with my students. I have to say that in Spain, I work in a faculty of education, so we teach to primary school students. So I think it is even more easier for us in Spain to get primary school teachers than to secondary school teachers, because they access to this kind of knowledge in a different way in a master after doing their degree in sports science, and I think it's a bit more different, but we do a lot of practice, and we do a lot of analysis of videos and all these things that are useful for them to develop a practical knowledge and to be able to do it later at schools.
Okay, so it's very interesting when we kind of start to get a pattern that it's very much the way, for example, that you three, the pathway that you follow, it's very much marked by your specific and particular personal background, with these contacts with the games, with this kind of context that really was favorable to it. So this couple of questions, we are trying to get a bit more, get to know a bit more our guests. Now, so this is more like introductory questions. I will pose different questions now, more to develop about other topics. And so in this process, we'll also open up now to the other participants that want to also pose questions on this basis or another. So obviously, Karen, so it's a problem that we are all trying to solve, that in order to disseminate, to have our future teachers, our in-service teachers, to buy into these pedagogies. So it's not easy. It's a difficult pathway, is a growing one. So what would you say if what is perhaps the most important, or where should we start with if we want to, for example, in teacher education, to get our future teachers to embrace this? Where should we start?
So I think we have to start in terms of teacher education. We have to think about making sure that the approach is embedded in all that we do. And very aspirational for me would be, I'd like to see all the activity courses at our university, taught using a game-based approach, so that I'd like to see all of our coaches doing more of that. So I think one is, it's never a one-off. We're not going to, we will not be able to provide the support for learning to occur kind of in one-shot deal. So, how do we embed things into programs? How do we think about, for example, at our conferences, even our 2-day conferences, how do we have multiple workshops that connect and really engage people in a critical thinking process? I think that's a key part of it. To some degree, my solution has been around developing programs. The connection, our approach at Bridgewater with Deb and Heidi, who's at Westfield, we do a lot of work together. But the notion that over time you're working on the approach, and you're getting support when you're in the field, and then you have professional development that connects. One other thing, and maybe this is a little bit off track, but I do think in our pre-service programs, we have to make sure that we have, I'd say, the right materials, the right equipment, so that we really we've demonstrated kind of the rescaling of games. I think I will take tennis as the example. I mean, it's fantastic that we can, teach tennis with low bounce balls and smaller rackets, and people can have a lot of success. So I think embedding it in programs so that you're experiencing it over a long period of time, getting support when you are learning the model, when you're out in the field, and then continue professional development, and then the notion that you even have in your head, how do you actually rescale games so that they fit and they work, and students are successful with them.
Great, Karen. Thank you. Tim, what about you? In this journey of yours in, training future teachers, can you trace back where you were as a teacher educator, several years ago, and now? What do you do differently? What have been, I don't know, the interesting points for you in this journey? What would you emphasize here?
Part of it is finding colleagues, people to network with. I mean, when I first started in Victoria, luckily it was a guy called Paul Smith who was doing beach volleyball, and he had this idea of 3 R's. So he and I then talked about the 4 R's, and then we were using that as a structure to develop perception action coupling before I knew about perception action coupling as a motor learning process. And it was very successful at getting the off the ball movements that Linda was talking about, right? And so we were basically blending things together, but I needed someone to work with. And then he and I formed a Thank God It's Friday club. And then all the students would come and join in, and we would just make up games and apply the 4 R's. And then we would, off the ball movements to contribute that. We started using the iPad as soon as it came out to see if we could code. So Louise's stuff, I mean, people were starting to play with, and I needed that community. And I remember reading about Rod and Dave going in and doing that same thing, that they needed to play with other teachers and just play at making games play was what we got into. And that led to the modification of adaptation idea, because I realized I was trying to teach student teachers to go out and start a lesson with a game that flopped. and if they're going to teach and they're going to practicum and it's the whole thing's a disaster, the practicum teacher's going to say, well, you're not going to pass because it's all right. And so they all end up going back to traditional methods. So to teach them to create a game that adapted to the students, to make a game that at least was close, now we can work on something because we're not having a terrible lesson at the beginning. And then we go back to the game and it's really improved. Then it was more persuasive. So that, the need for something that was a bit more came out of that exchange. And so it's finding, I think, as an educator, I need to be connected to the environment I'm putting my student teachers into and be aware of that as I'm trying to help them take up these new approaches, because the power structures in there are very strong. And so you have to be there to create space that allows them to build that confidence that they can then take the lead rather than leave them vulnerable and they can't get back from it, right? So that's a sort of realization. And my final point is, now when I'm teaching my courses, I've always integrated them in schools, but I go out now. I have to try and have 1 or 2 schools because you spend too much time traveling, but go out and help my student teachers start their lessons off by just observing. And sometimes I just say, oh, can I just join in? And I just do something with the lesson because I know what they've planned. And then I give it back to them. And it works great.
Yeah.
And they end up, oh, I get it now, because they saw me do it in the context when it wasn't quite working. But to create that sort of space is, I learned that in Singapore because I went and did a PD in Singapore and they were doing that with me. It was a great way of teaching. But that's the way to make it work.
Yeah, and it feels great when you go to schools and we just want to teach again. I know I do. And sometimes I just tweak it a bit and enter in at the middle of the game. So thank you for that, Tim. Luis, in this journey, your journey as a educator, trying to train your future teachers to be as best as they can be and teach game-based approach and other models, I would guess. So what are the main challenges in trying to make the student-centered approaches like an embodied part of their professional identity, that they don't just do it because, for example, the pre-service teachers are getting perhaps or perceive they will have a better grade because they apply the models, but they actually believe in it. What do you think are the major challenge as a teacher educator that we face in that process?
Well, I think when you are a student at the beginning, you want to be loyal to a pedagogy, to pedagogical strategies, and in this way, I have tried to adapt my teaching to those pedagogies which are more realistic, which could be applied in real physical education classes. So. For example, at the beginning, I tried to be very loyal to the Bunker, Thorpe, and Elmont proposal. When I discovered the book of Linda Griffin, Stephen Mitchell, and Judy Oslin, I saw that there was another more practical way of teaching games for understanding. And after that, what I tried is that I realized that if the students were able to understand the complexity of games, they would be able to adapt games to students as much as necessary. So that was for me that is the key question. They have to become independent from very strict or very rigid proposals, and try to have a very deep understanding of games so they can adapt them as much as they need for the students to be able to learn. And I think the rest of the things are strategies that we include for questioning or whatever, are other strategies that we include to help this other of the adaptation of tactical complexity. Yeah.
So no matter how much expert we have, we all need some ontological security, some ontological conceptual security. So to that, well, grounds our feet in the floor. And so now I would open the question asking to the participants. If you could just raise your hand with the sign, but I have already Rena Tanabe. Sorry, did I pronounce it well? More or less.
Nice to meet you. I'm Rena Tanabe from Japan. I'm teacher at an elementary school. I participated in this meeting for the first time today. I'm sorry, I came in from the middle, so there was something I did not understand. Please tell me. You corrected that I'm participating in this discussion room, or there are any other room for discussion?
Oh no, this is the main room right now. We are having the roundtable experts. So everybody, all the participants are just at this spot over here now.
Yeah, okay. ここで This room is okay?
Yes.
よかった。Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, Rena? Or that was just to make sure. I have a. Okay, thank you, Rena. I have a question by Aspasia.
I think, Claudio, there is a question before me from Adriano. Sorry.
I'm not seeing
in the chat.
Okay, sorry. Let me
No.
chat over here. Okay. I have a question here. You're right. Let me pass it through. Okay, question from Adriano de Souza. So, in your opinions, what are the two most necessary tools, competencies to be developed or discovered in the TGfU game-based approach that will benefit game learners and athletes who play the game sports in competitive performance scenarios? I can repeat if you... So the most necessary tools to be developed either in a PE and sport context in competitive scenarios. Tim, please.
So ones I've been working actually with Karen, because we've been working together with her tennis graduate level program, which has allowed me really to play around with tennis a lot more. And Steve Mitchell actually with Linda and Julie put this in their book where they were talking about time and space and risk. And so those three things now, I always tell people, this is how you drive your understanding of the game. For instance, if I'm playing tennis, how do you create time for yourself in order to get the ball back? Well, that means catching, throwing, or self-rally and get it back. But as soon as you build that in, then the student has time to play around with force. And the force is how you generate forces on the ball to get it in the right direction. Oh, and now I'm playing around with space. And so using those terms, I find it helps people get away from skill, but realizing that the forces, that is the skill, is embedded in the time, space, risk component of playing the game. And when you put scoring in, the risk really starts to come about. So those 4 things I find are my major structures to help break down the game whilst embedding the skill element within this force understanding rather than technique. And then it becomes situated in the game way easier.
Thank you, Tim. Luis or Karen, you could add if you wish, or we can move on to another question. Please be my guest.
Yeah, I'd love to add on to that, because I think the other essential piece is the notion that you really have, and again, these are Tim's words, like a good game. You need to have conditions where you have a good game that people want to stay engaged in. And so when you modify the game so that you have time to be able to make a response, you're more likely to have a game that has flow and back and forth. And again, so that notion of how do you create a good game, which is a close game, we have to think about not both teams or both whoever your opponent is always having the same constraints to the game. So I think the most fundamental place that I have grown and changed over the years is knowing that there's a need for adaptation, and that is that the 2 groups are not going to have the same conditions that they're playing under. So again, I might be allowed to have a self rally when I'm playing Tim in a game of tennis, or he may have a larger space to defend. So to me, a good game is essential, and that's going to allow people to stay engaged. And again, that idea of modification by adaptation, it fundamentally has shifted the way that I think about using a game-based approach.
Luis, you can either add or we can move on to another question.
Yes, just a little bit. Just a little bit more of elaboration about what Tim and Karen said. I think when we are talking about performance scenarios, we are talking about transfer in very specific competition situations. So what I try to make sure when I coach, and I want to make sure these transfers happens, is that the situation, the game that Karen said just before is really similar. And sometimes the task I propose is not a game; it's a task, but with a high tactical complexity, but not necessarily a game. Because sometimes when you try if you want to make sure that transfer happens, sometimes the games are not specific enough. So what I have to say is that here we have to make sure that the player develops this tactical competency, and we have to choose very well between games and high tactical complexity tasks. That's all.
Great. Aspasia?
I have a different question. I heard at the beginning that Professor García López is engaged with salutogenesis theory and critical pedagogy, and from my short experience with critical pedagogy, I saw great value in myself, in my teaching. So I would like to hear some points about this. How can we achieve this sense of coherence that Antonovsky is talking about in the salutogenesis theory within games teaching? I find a great connection, but it would be helpful to link these different concepts.
Well, Aspasia, thank you very much for that question. Well, what I am doing with my PhD students at the moment is that we are hybridizing sport education and teaching kids for understanding with the activist approaches. We think that both sport education and teaching kids for understanding are student-centered approaches, but sometimes when we are, sometimes the focus could be more in what they learn than in what they feel and how they empower with these tactical approaches. So it's very important for us to make sure that there is more than learning, that is a co-construction of the curriculum. And I think the activist approach, which are based on very deep critical pedagogy, could be a very useful pedagogy to get that sense of coherence. Salutogenesis is a strength-based approach. So I think it has lots and lots of connections with the activist approach, which is it is funded in critical pedagogy. And I think if you analyze small wins and all the three dimensions of the sense of coherence, you will find that if you add to the teaching games for understanding and sport education, you add them all this co-construction of the curriculum, you get a very powerful tool for developing this sense of coherence. Yes.
Aspasia, did you say you had another question to another guest?
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luis. I have a question from Luisa Striga from Portugal. Is it crucial to have in-depth knowledge of a given game to be able to teach it through game-based approach? Who wants to pick on that one? Pick up on that one.
I'll
Karen,
start then, but I was going to let Karen go because she has to run a program with this in mind. No, I don't think so, but I think you have to have an openness to understanding a game. And I'm going back actually to the previous question. The inventing game process that Joy was always advocating, and Len Alman before her, I think a good teacher that puts people in that situation, they understand the game category suddenly, and they have a lens in which to understand games they've never played before. But you have to get people to that sense of awareness of the learner. And then maybe I think we too often with student teachers or pre-service teachers, the awareness of learners and learning is not sophisticated enough to understand. But when I go and work with teachers who work in these environments, they seem to pick up on it really quickly because they understand the learners and the learning, and they just need to have a different way of understanding the game so that they can access it without thinking they're not good at it. But I think maybe our university program should be like 2 years, go and teach for 3 years, and then come back, because I think then you're ready to learn it. But you need to have that experience with kids, natural way of learning, and realize that you've got to overcome some of your inhibitions around not knowing the sport.
Yeah. Karen, would you like to add or skip this one?
I'll quickly add, because again, I was going to use the same word that Tim uses, that you have to have, if you don't have a lot of content knowledge in the sport, then you do have to have real openness that you are really learning this as the students are learning. And I think that that's I think that's a really interesting place to be, because you don't end up using terminology that you don't understand. It's like you really are learning together. But there's also something really beautiful about seeing someone who has deep content knowledge teach using a game-based approach. It's like, so to me, it can work either way, but if you don't really understand the game, then you have to be open that you are learning as the students are learning. So for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, so it is impossible to, for example, if a pre-serviceer going to the school placement, that the year before, we present them with every possible situation and content that they will get. So that's impossible. So they would have to do a full year school placement before they go to the school placement. So I would also like to thank Tim. He has dropped in the chat a couple of references on this that they have been discussing. So if you want to check it later. I have a question here from Diana Nyland for Karen or anyone. So suggestions for selling the ideas of a connected approach of topics, a PD diploma track at a smaller local conference to people who don't know they need that IFO?
Well, I think it's when you deliver something that's quality and people are learning and it connects and it meets them where they're at, then they keep coming back for more. And again, I am an eternal optimist. I tend to see that, but I think that if you create professional development that is connected and you really are meeting the teachers and seeing what they bring to the table, then they're going to persist with you throughout a workshop. You can incentivize it. You can give a certificate at the end if you want. I mean, we know how to, there are ways, but we can also do things like draw on things like from sport ed, create them as a group and a team throughout a professional development and see what they can create and make those connections and those things, I think work.
Great. I have another question here from Fari Han. I hope I pronounce it well. What is your expectations in the next 10 or 20 years for pedagogy field, especially for game-based approach, to be more relevant in line with the mainstream changes? Luis, do you want to start with this one? Can you unmute, or I can read it again?
Sorry, that's okay. It's okay. Thank you. Well, the thing is that I really believe that teaching game-based approaches in physical education has a long. We have to get more teachers to use it, but there's a lot of research and there's a lot of experience and there's a lot of information. I think these mainstream changes should arrive to coaching games for understanding. I think there's a lot to do there. The context is completely different. So we have to be able to adapt all the critical elements of game-based approaches to coaching games for understanding. I think that could be my opinion.
Great. Tim, besides of lots of tennis playing and golf playing, where do you see yourself on game-based approach in 10, 20 years?
Two things I think are going to make a difference. And I think David's actually researching some of this. The sport organization bodies are moving in this direction. So the whole notion of play, practice, play, I'm hearing it all the time in different sports, not just in tennis, but it's in soccer. It's always been in rugby, right? I'm seeing it in pickleball now because pickleball in Canada is now following Tennis Canada. So I think that notion of how you coach is being advocated. That follows what TGfU initiated and the other approaches, game-based approaches. So I think in the 10 years time, I would see all sports are doing it that way, because I know in the US, for instance, they're looking at Tennis Canada and saying, well, what are you doing? Because you've got so many more people playing relative to your population and more success. What are we doing here that's not matching up? So there's this internalizing, when someone gets ahead. And Tennis Canada copied actually Belgium and France, right? And then Australia was also on that. So there's all this sort of nationality governing sports are shifting their practice and saying that traditional skill-based isn't the right way. And then the other one is technology. What we're doing now, the fact we're communicating here, the fact Karen and I and Jen have made a whole freaking YouTube channel on doing tennis. Everybody's going to be making channels like that try to facilitate the understanding that isn't based on language or written, but actually shows it. And tools like the video catch and use of analysis and being able to see yourself get better at playing the game and using that in school as an assessment tool, that's got to shift the learning. Because once I put an iPad in front of kids, I can go to inner city schools and put an iPad, and we're doing inventing games, and those kids are as good as gold. You can't even, the autistic and ADHD kid cannot be found. They're self-organizing around that iPad and their game they just made up. So the whole notion of how we get at knowing, I think, is going to shift because of the tools we have available.
Great. Karen, would you like to add something to this perspective, the 20 years perspective? Or we can swap questions, that's okay. We are running out of time in the meantime.
I'll just quickly, I think my 20-year perspective, I do think the national governing boards of our sport will, just reiterate what Tim says, can really change the trajectory of people's sport experiences. And then that becomes kind of the norm of what we think sport practice looks like. But I guess really my hope 20 years from now, we really we think about who gets to play these games, whose games are they? And we really start to, or we just dig more deeply into the systems that have been created around, whose games we play, what spaces we play on. So I think we have to look at how, racism and oppression and poverty has impacted, what games we value and whose games we value. So I guess my hope is that 20 years from now, where there's more people from more continents in this room, and we are playing different games because we really have seen the value in them.
So I was. We are touching the end of this meeting, of this roundtable. Linda, what will you say that we extend this for another 5 minutes or so, if there is one question, and shorten the break, or
no, that's fine. I would do that.
Yeah, this is such a wonderful and unique opportunity to have you all here. Is there any questions? Otherwise, I can place one question, one final one. Oh, Rena, please go ahead.
Thank you. I have question for everyone. I value children making exercise. There's something I'm worried about there. Children are good at remaking play. When children want to use what they are thinking for rule and movement, it's difficult to get everyone's consent. However, if you think about each group, you need time share and play. How do you think about children's creative movement and sharing?
I know, Luis, you want to start? You were.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question.
Okay, perhaps you, Karen or Tim, do you want to hint on it? Just provide that. Okay. That's okay. That's no worries, Lina. So
I would hazard one answer, maybe if I interpret it properly, Renee. Like playground games or games that kids play and make up. Normally, you see some negotiation because they want to keep playing. But not all kids are in that same mindset, right? And so that goes back to what Linda was talking about with the social emotional nature of who we are. We have to be aware of how we affect others' play. And so part of our role as educators is realizing that we're there to create, like Rebecca was talking about, that flow experience. Because when little kids play, intensely play, they love it. And they want to do it again. And that's actually, I think, in essence, we all play that way when we play our more adult sports. And so we have to help them reflect on how they just disrupted that game and what could they do differently in order to enable that game, that play experience to come back. And I think that's the beginning of them becoming more democratic citizens who are empathetic to others and want to give way to in order to gain something bigger than their own ego and what, to be right or And that's a complex, but that's what early childhood is about. That's what elementary school playgrounds are about. And I think they're the wonderful places of learning when teachers are helping kids negotiate those things effectively.
Right. I think if I understood it correctly, Rina, it touched somehow what you were mentioning, at least. I hope you are happy with this answer. So to finalize, either Karen very briefly and then Luis. Karen, what is that ingredient that cannot miss in teacher education, if nothing else? At least do this if you want to have future game-based approaches teachers.
You have to look at your students and see your students and see what their experience is in the game. And you have to be a person who is a game designer. You have to think, I am a game designer. How am I creative as a teacher to create a game that works for the children who are in front of me in this moment? So you are a game designer who sees the students or children in front of them.
Luis, if nothing else, what should a future teacher?
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree with Karen. You have to understand the complexity very well, and you have to be able to adapt and design the proper game for the students you have. This is there was another question in the chat about which were the most interesting structure of the lesson, the 3 segments work or the 5 segment works. I would never worry about that. I think you have to adapt, and if you are able to get the complexity, and if you are able to see what Karen was saying, if you are able to see what students need, I think you will be the best teacher you can be.
Great. I think this has been a priceless moment. So, and the time flew. I don't know if it was my impression of your impression too. This means that it was very, very good. So thank you so much for you being here. If nothing else, I would invite you to, in about 10 minutes, to our final keynote, okay, and the closing ceremony. So in 10 minutes, so this would be 2:30, okay? See you in a bit.
Thank you. Bye.